We're now going to proceed over to my colleague Mylene Freeman, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Mansur, I'm not quite understanding how you're linking a policy of multiculturalism and openness and inclusion to security threats. Could you possibly try and draw that causal link for me? Because I'm seeing multiculturalism and inclusion as part of what liberal democratic values are and part of what this country is about, not the opposite. I don't think that it's I think rather the opposite. Policies of exclusion can breed intolerance. And could you please explain to me how you're making this link?
Well, I would very respectfully say the problem that you're raising is particularly the problem that has come about in the last 40 years of bending the rules of liberal democracy, which is very respectful and inclusive of individuals, into saying that, you know, we're not going to say some things about others in the basis of their collective cultural values and rights. We have this problem right now in Quebec. I mean, if you're following what has happened there with their bill dealing with the question of hijab and niqab, this has been a huge problem in Europe. Now, is that a question of simply a cultural value, or there are security implications? We've had this debate here. I have appeared in the committee here talking about face uncovering for passport photographs and identities and so on and so forth. So that is part of the security issue if you're talking about it. You know, I think our police forces and our security forces are daily running into problems. I've spoken to a lot of police officers. Some of them are my friends who deal with this problem on a daily basis. So yeah, there are cultural sensitivities here, and that is protected by the multicultural values. And so that's where the drift is and where the problem is, and which is where I'm putting my fingers on.
Well, I mean, you in an interview with Phyllis Chesler, Professor Phyllis Chesler, you say that when asked what you think Canada's immigration policy should be, you answer that it's a complicated subject, and quote, that my own view is there should be some sort of moratorium on immigration from the Muslim world, given the nature of politics and culture exported from there to the West. So what you're meaning is things that aren't compatible with liberal democracy, not actually Muslim culture. Given that you are yourself Muslim, I assume that it isn't. It seems here like you're saying all Muslims will not be compatible in liberal democratic value systems, which I'd like you to explain or elaborate if that's your view, because unfortunately I just don't see how that is the case.
Honourable member, I can explain to you by analogy if the time permits. The people who understood what the problems of communism were people from within the belly of communism. If I remind you of names like Natan Sharansky and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Václav Havel and others, this was a global struggle. And it was a struggle, you know, which was, in a sense, a life and death struggle. And there were people inside the Soviet Union, as there are inside China, Liu Xiaobo and others, who understand what is at stake. So it is not that the whole Muslim world is completely driven underground. There's a huge struggle going on right now as I speak. But the problem and the challenge is that the organized mainstream Islam is incompatible with liberal democracy. Well, and we as a society have decided not to question these things.
I think the member is
I would like to talk a little bit about, I mean, in this interview, you do talk about the fact that, you know, for instance, in the Shafia case, these girls didn't have access to resources. I mean, isn't the problem really our giving access to these girls and making sure that they have safe spaces and places to get out of these situations like any other Canadian girl would, that are culturally appropriate, like that are Muslim, women's centers or something like that, somewhere where they can go and feel comfortable, just like we do that for Aboriginal women and needs to be done for Aboriginal women and girls like myself who, have generations back in Canada. I still have friends like me who come under abuse as women. So this is something that's more about resources and not actually about Muslims. So if you could maybe talk about some of the resources we need for addressing these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I'm a father of a beautiful young girl, and I hope she will grow up to be a very strong woman like yourself, madam, and will have a role to play in Canada. And I want her to be that. I want her to be a free and brave woman. But I wouldn't like to see what has happened to a woman who wanted to be brave, and like any other Canadian, who was strangulated, like Aksa Parve. She just wanted to be a Canadian woman. And every aspect of what is Canada was ignored to Aksa Parvez, as it was ignored to the girls, the Shafila family, and there are innumerable such things. And that is the fundamental contradiction that we have brought upon ourselves. We have contorted our society. That's the Europeans are now facing up to it. And some of us will have to face up to it. Maybe you members are reluctant to face up to it for all sorts of political consideration. And some of us have to speak out. So ironically, as a Muslim, I'm speaking out here, reminding you that this is a deep struggle that is going on. This is a 1400-year struggle. So when you tell me that this is not something to do about Islam or about Muslim, it's simply about the resources, well, that's a patchwork answer. Yes, we have symptoms, and so it's like an illness. You have to deal with it aspirin or with other medication. So yes, the resource center. But that doesn't answer the fundamental problem that we are importing into our country. I only raise the issue of Islam, but there is all sorts of other issues.
Right. So, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned, the Bouchard-Taylor report a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
In it, I mean, you know the difference between basically secularism and laicity that Charles Taylor will draw. So maybe give a quick explanation of that for the committee. I don't know how much time I have.
You have about 32 seconds to respond.
In that case, what I will go ahead and say is essentially that I think you're arguing for something that sounds a lot more like laicity to me, which is a lot more like what European countries have done that have led them to the situation of not being able to accept other communities. Whereas Canada has been struggling to obviously struggling, but I think succeeding in a sense, to create a secularism where everybody is included, and that means that we do need to bring out tensions, and we do need to make sure that in the end, I agree, liberal democracy needs to be withheld, women's rights need to be withheld, for instance, but that isn't something that I think is tied necessarily to shutting out communities or shutting them into themselves, but rather openness. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Freeman?